Martha Henderson had lived in the same small house on Maple Street for over 60 years. At 90 years old, she moved a bit slower than she used to, but her mind was as sharp as the day she returned from her service in the Women's Army Corps during the Korean War. Every morning, she would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock, make herself a cup of black coffee, and sit on her front porch with her faithful companion. Rex was a German Shepherd mix, now 8 years old, who had been with Martha since he was just a puppy. She had found him shivering behind the local grocery store on a cold winter night, abandoned and scared. From that moment, they became inseparable. Rex had the intelligence of his breed and the loyalty that only a rescued dog could possess. His golden brown coat had started showing patches of gray around his muzzle, but his dark eyes remained alert and protective. The neighborhood had changed quite a bit over the years. Many of Martha's old friends had either passed away or moved to assisted living facilities. Young families had moved in, bringing children who would wave at Martha from their bicycles and sometimes stop to pet Rex. She enjoyed watching the neighborhood kids play in the street during summer evenings, reminding her of simpler times when she was raising her own children in this very house. Martha's daily routine was simple but meaningful. After her morning coffee, she would take Rex for a slow walk around the block. Her arthritis made the journey longer than it used to be, but Rex never seemed to mind. He would patiently wait when she needed to stop and rest, always staying close by her side. During these walks, neighbors would often stop to chat, asking about her health and sharing news from around the community. In the afternoons, Martha would tend to her small garden behind the house. She grew tomatoes, peppers, and herbs, though she couldn't manage as much as she once did. Rex would lie in the shade nearby, watching her work and occasionally getting up to investigate interesting smells or sounds. The garden had been her husband's pride and joy when he was alive, and maintaining it was her way of keeping his memory close. The evenings were Martha's favorite time of day. She would sit in her comfortable recliner by the window, reading books from the library or working on crossword puzzles. Rex would curl up on the rug beside her chair, content to be near his beloved owner. Sometimes she would tell him stories about her time in the army, about the friends she had made and the places she had seen. Rex would listen with the patience that only dogs possess, his ears perking up at the sound of her voice. Martha had been awarded several medals during her service, including a Bronze Star for her work in field communications. She had served her country with pride and had never asked for special recognition or thanks. The medal sat quietly in a box in her bedroom closet, brought out only occasionally when local school children visited to interview veterans for their history projects. Her children lived in different states now, busy with their own families and careers. They called regularly and visited when they could, but Martha understood that life moved on. She had Rex, her garden, her books, and her memories. It was enough. She had learned long ago that happiness came from appreciating what you had, rather than mourning what you had lost. The house itself showed its age, like Martha did. The paint was fading in places and some of the wooden steps creaked when she walked on them. But it was home, filled with photographs of family, souvenirs from travels with her late husband and the comfortable furniture they had bought together decades ago. Every corner held a memory. Every room told a story of a life well lived. Rex seemed to understand that his job was to take care of Martha, just as she took care of him. He would alert her to visitors at the door, though his bark had become more of a gentle woof in his older years. When Martha had trouble sleeping, Rex would sense her restlessness and come to lie beside her bed until she felt calm again. During thunderstorms, when Martha's old war injuries would ache, Rex would stay close, providing comfort with his warm presence. The neighbors had always respected Martha and Rex. The mailman, who had been delivering to the same route for 15 years, would always stop to say hello and give Rex a pat. The young mother next door would often bring over extra baked goods, knowing that Martha lived alone. The teenager across the street would shovel her walkway in winter without being asked, refusing any payment except Martha's grateful smile. This peaceful routine had continued for years without interruption. Martha felt safe in her neighborhood, surrounded by people who cared about her and protected by Rex's faithful presence. She had no reason to expect that anything would change. The community had always been quiet, friendly, and respectful. Crime was rare, and most problems were small, neighborly disputes that got resolved quickly with conversation and understanding. But change was coming to Maple Street, whether Martha was ready for it or not. Soon, her quiet world would be disrupted in ways she could never have imagined. The peace and safety she had known for so many years would be challenged, and both she and Rex would need to find strength they didn't know they still possessed. As Martha sat on her porch that warm Tuesday morning, watching Rex sniff around the small flower bed beside the front steps, she had no idea that this would be one of the last normal days she would have for quite some time. The sound of motorcycle engines was still just a distant rumble, barely noticeable above the morning birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves in the oak tree that shaded her front yard. The rumble started small, like distant thunder on a clear day. Martha looked up from her morning newspaper, wondering if a storm was approaching despite the sunny sky. Rex's ears perked up and he lifted his head from where he had been resting on the porch. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until it became clear that it wasn't weather at all. A group of motorcycles turned the corner onto Maple Street, their engines roaring loud enough to wake anyone who might still be sleeping at 8 in the morning. There were 5 of them, all riding big, heavy bikes with chrome that gleamed in the morning sunlight. The riders wore leather jackets and bandanas, and even from her porch, Martha could see that they looked rough. Around the edges, the motorcycles came to a stop right in front of the house 2 doors down from Martha's. The Johnson family had moved out 3 months ago when Mr. Johnson got transferred to another city. The house had been sitting empty ever since, with a for rent sign in the front yard that had been getting more weathered with each passing week. One of the bikers, a large man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos, pulled out a set of keys and walked up to the front door of the empty house. The others followed, carrying duffel bags and cases that they pulled from the storage compartments of their bikes. Within minutes, it became clear that they were moving in. Rex stood up on the porch, his body tense and alert. His nose twitched as he caught unfamiliar scents carried on the morning breeze. Martha reached down to stroke his head, trying to calm him, but she felt a knot of worry forming in her stomach. She had lived long enough to recognize trouble when she saw it, and something about these new neighbors didn't sit right with her. Over the next few days, the pattern became clear. The bikers would leave in the morning, their engines roaring to life and disturbing the peace of the quiet neighborhood. They would return at all hours of the night, sometimes accompanied by other motorcycles that would park in front of the house and idle loudly while their riders went inside. Music would often blare from the house late into the evening, bass thumping so loud that Martha could feel it vibrating through her living room. The neighbors began to talk. Mrs. Chen from across the street mentioned to Martha that she had called the police about the noise, but nothing seemed to come of it. The young family next door to Martha started keeping their children inside more often, no longer letting them play in the front yard like they used to. The teenager who had always shoveled Martha's walkway stopped coming around altogether. Martha noticed that Rex had become more vigilant during their daily walks. His usual friendly demeanor had been replaced by a cautious alertness. He would watch the biker house carefully as they passed, his ears forward and his body ready to react to any threat. Martha found herself taking a different route for their walks, going around the block the long way to avoid passing directly in front of the house. The first direct confrontation happened on a Thursday afternoon. Martha was working in her garden with Rex lying in his usual spot under the shade tree when she heard loud voices coming from the street. She looked up to see 2 of the bikers standing in their front yard, bottles of beer in their hands despite the early hour. "Hey, old lady," one of them called out, his voice carrying easily across the yards. "Your dog's been barking all night. Keep him quiet, or we'll give you something to really complain about." Martha's hands trembled slightly as she continued working with her tomato plants. Rex had not barked all night. In fact, he rarely barked at all anymore. She knew the accusation was false, but she also knew better than to argue with men who were clearly looking for a fight. Rex had lifted his head and was watching the bikers carefully, but he remained calm and quiet. "Did you hear me, Granny?" The same biker shouted, taking a few steps toward Martha's property line. "I said keep that mutt quiet." This time Rex stood up. He didn't bark or growl, but his posture changed. Martha could see the protective instincts that had been bred into his ancestors coming to the surface. She quietly called his name and he moved closer to her side, positioning himself between Martha and the bikers. The incident ended when the bikers were distracted by another motorcycle arriving, but Martha felt shaken for the rest of the day. She realized that her peaceful life was about to become much more complicated. That evening, she called her daughter in California and mentioned the new neighbors, though she tried to downplay her concerns. She didn't want her children to worry about her, and she certainly didn't want them to suggest that she moved to some retirement community. The harassment escalated gradually over the following weeks. The bikers would rev their engines loudly whenever they saw Martha outside. They would deliberately drive their motorcycles across her lawn, leaving tire tracks in the grass that her late husband had lovingly maintained for decades. Empty beer bottles started appearing in her yard, tossed carelessly from the house next door. One evening, Martha found garbage scattered across her driveway, clearly thrown over from their property. As she bent down to clean it up, moving slowly because of her arthritis, she heard laughter coming from the biker house. Through the window, she could see several of them watching her and pointing. Rex became increasingly protective as the situation worsened. He would no longer settle peacefully on the porch during their morning routine. Instead, he would pace back and forth, keeping watch on the house 2 doors down. During their walks, he stayed even closer to Martha's side, and she could feel the tension in his body as they moved through the neighborhood. Other neighbors had begun to avoid the area altogether. The mail carrier started delivering mail to houses on their side of the street first, then quickly moving to the other side to avoid lingering near the biker house. Children no longer played outside unsupervised, and several neighbors had installed additional outdoor lighting and security cameras. Martha's routine, which had brought her comfort and structure for so many years, was slowly being destroyed. She found herself checking the locks on her doors multiple times each night and keeping the curtains drawn during the day. The garden work that had always brought her peace now felt dangerous and exposed. Even Rex seemed to sense that their safe, quiet world was slipping away. The breaking point was approaching, though Martha didn't know it yet. The bikers had clearly decided that the elderly veteran and her loyal dog were easy targets for their harassment. They had no idea that they were about to discover just how wrong they were about both Martha's strength and Rex's protective capabilities. The situation took a darker turn on a rainy Saturday morning in late September. Martha had been hoping that the cooler weather might calm things down, but instead it seemed to make the bikers more aggressive. They had been drinking heavily the night before, and their loud party had kept most of the neighborhood awake until well past midnight. Martha was sitting by her living room window, reading a book and listening to the gentle patter of rain on the roof, when she saw one of the bikers walking directly toward her house. He was the biggest of the group, the one with the thick beard who seemed to be their leader. Rex immediately sensed the approaching threat and moved to the window, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The man walked right up to Martha's front door and began pounding on it with his fist, hard enough to make the old wooden frame shake. "Open up, old woman," he shouted. "We need to talk." Martha's heart began racing, but she stayed seated and tried to remain calm. She had learned during her military service that showing fear only made bullies more aggressive. Rex positioned himself between Martha and the door, his body rigid with tension. The pounding continued, accompanied by increasingly hostile demands for Martha to answer. "I know you're in there," the biker yelled. "Your stupid dog keeps barking and waking us up. If you don't train him better, we're going to take care of the problem ourselves." This was clearly a lie. Rex was one of the quietest dogs in the neighborhood, and Martha knew that her neighbors would have complained if there had been any real problem with barking. The biker was simply looking for an excuse to intimidate her. After several more minutes of pounding and shouting, he finally gave up and walked back to his house, but not before kicking over Martha's small flower pot that sat beside the front steps. That afternoon, when the rain stopped, Martha discovered that someone had trampled through her vegetable garden during the night. The tomato plants that she had carefully tended all summer were broken and scattered. Her pepper plants had been pulled up by the roots and thrown across the yard. Months of work had been destroyed in what was clearly an act of deliberate vandalism. Rex sniffed carefully around the damaged garden, his nose following trails that only he could detect. Martha could tell from his behavior that he recognized the scent of the people who had caused the destruction. She felt tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at the ruined plants, but she quickly wiped them away. She refused to let these bullies see her cry. The harassment became more frequent and more personal over the following days. The bikers would wait until they saw Martha outside, then rev their engines and shout crude comments at her. They started calling her names related to her age and the fact that she lived alone. They made jokes about her military service, claiming that women didn't belong in the army, and that she probably never saw any real action. These comments hurt Martha more than the physical destruction of her property. She had served her country with pride and had earned her medals through genuine acts of courage and dedication. Hearing her service mocked by people who had probably never sacrificed anything for anyone else filled her with an anger she hadn't felt in years. One evening, as Martha was bringing in her mail, 3 of the bikers approached her from across the street. Rex was inside the house, and Martha found herself alone on her front porch as the men walked up her driveway. They surrounded her, standing close enough that she could smell the alcohol on their breath and see the meanness in their eyes. "Listen here, Grandma," the leader said, his voice low and threatening. "We're tired of your complaints to the police. We know you've been calling them about us." Martha hadn't actually called the police herself, though she knew some of her neighbors had. But she could see that these men weren't interested in the truth. They had decided she was their enemy, and they were looking for any excuse to escalate their intimidation tactics. "We live here now," another one added, stepping even closer. "This is our neighborhood. If you don't like it, maybe it's time for you to find somewhere else to live." Martha's military training kicked in, and she stood straighter despite her fear. "This is my home," she said quietly but firmly. "I've lived here for 60 years and I have every right to be here." The bikers laughed at her response, apparently amused by the idea that this elderly woman thought she could stand up to them. "Rights don't mean much when you're all alone," the leader said. "Accidents happen to old people all the time. Maybe you should think about that." The threat was clear, and Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. These men were talking about hurting her, possibly seriously. She realized that the situation had moved far beyond simple neighborhood harassment. She was dealing with people who might actually be dangerous. From inside the house, Rex had heard the voices and sensed Martha's distress. She could hear him pacing by the front door, occasionally letting out a soft whine of anxiety. The bikers noticed the sound as well, and their attention turned toward the house. "That dog of yours better stay inside," one of them warned. "We don't like aggressive animals in the neighborhood. Sometimes they just disappear, you know what I mean?" Now they were threatening Rex as well as Martha. She felt her protective instincts rising, the same ones that had made her such an effective soldier all those years ago. These men had made a serious mistake when they decided to threaten her dog. Rex wasn't just her pet. He was her family, her companion, her loyal friend who had never asked for anything except her love and care. The bikers eventually left, but their message had been delivered. They wanted Martha to feel isolated, vulnerable, and afraid. They wanted her to believe that she had no options except to submit to their harassment or leave her home. What they didn't understand was that they had just threatened the 2 things Martha valued most in the world: her independence and her beloved dog. That night, Martha sat in her living room with Rex beside her chair, thinking about her options. She could call her children, but they would immediately want her to move away, and she wasn't ready to give up her home. She could call the police again, but the bikers hadn't actually done anything that would result in serious charges, and their complaints would probably just make the harassment worse. As she sat there in the darkness, listening to Rex's steady breathing and feeling his warm presence beside her, Martha made a decision. She wasn't going to run away from these bullies. She had faced worse enemies than a group of motorcycle riders, and she had survived. She was a decorated veteran, a woman who had served her country with honor, and she wasn't about to let a bunch of criminals drive her from her own home. Rex seemed to sense her determination. He lifted his head and looked at her with those intelligent dark eyes, as if he was telling her that whatever happened, they would face it together. Martha reached down to stroke his head, drawing comfort from his loyalty and strength. She had no idea that very soon, both of their resolves would be tested in ways they had never imagined. The next 2 weeks brought an ominous calm to Maple Street. The bikers continued their daily routines of loud departures and late-night returns, but they seemed to be leaving Martha alone. She wondered if perhaps her firm response to their threats had actually worked, if they had decided she wasn't worth the trouble. But Rex's behavior suggested otherwise. The dog had become increasingly vigilant, spending hours each day positioned by the front window, where he could watch the biker house. His meals went half-eaten, and he showed little interest in his usual games or walks. Martha recognized the signs from her military days. Rex was in a state of high alert, sensing danger that hadn't yet materialized but was certainly approaching. Martha used this quiet period to prepare. She made sure all her doors and windows had working locks, and she moved the cordless phone to her bedside table so she could call for help quickly if needed. She also spent time reviewing the home defense techniques she had learned decades ago. Muscle memory that she hoped would still serve her if the situation became truly dangerous. More importantly, she reached out to the few neighbors who still seemed willing to get involved. Mrs. Chen agreed to keep an eye on Martha's house and call the police if she saw anything suspicious. The young mother next door promised to listen for any sounds of trouble, though Martha could see the fear in her eyes when they talked. The neighborhood that had once been a close-knit community was now a collection of scared, isolated households. On a crisp October morning, Martha's intuition proved correct. She was having her usual coffee on the front porch when she noticed unusual activity at the biker house. More motorcycles than usual were parked outside, and she could see people moving around in the yard, setting up what looked like party supplies. Beer coolers were being carried outside, along with a large grill and several folding tables. Rex immediately sensed that something was different. He paced restlessly on the porch, his ears constantly moving as he tried to identify and categorize every sound coming from the direction of the biker house. Martha tried to coax him inside, but he refused to leave his post. His instincts were telling him that today would be the day their patience and preparation would be tested. By noon, the party was in full swing. Music blared from large speakers, and the smell of grilling meat mixed with cigarette smoke and exhaust fumes from the constantly arriving motorcycles. Martha counted at least 15 bikes parked in front of the house and spilling onto the street. The riders were drinking heavily, their voices getting louder and more aggressive as the afternoon wore on. Martha stayed inside, trying to read and pretend that nothing unusual was happening, but the noise made concentration impossible. Rex had positioned himself by the front door, his body tense and ready. Every so often he would let out a low whine of anxiety, looking at Martha as if asking her what they should do about the obvious threat developing just 2 houses away. As evening approached, the party showed no signs of winding down. If anything, it was getting more raucous. Martha could hear glass breaking and loud cheering, along with the sound of motorcycles being revved aggressively. The music had shifted to something with heavy bass that made her windows vibrate, and she could hear crude jokes and laughter that seemed to be getting closer to her property. Around 8 o'clock, Martha's worst fears were confirmed. Through her front window, she could see several of the bikers pointing at her house and laughing. One of them picked up a beer bottle and threw it in the direction of her front yard, where it shattered on the sidewalk. The action was met with cheers and encouragement from the others. Rex's reaction was immediate and intense. He began pacing back and forth by the front door, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor as he moved. He would occasionally stop to look at Martha, then return to his vigil by the door. She could see that every muscle in his body was coiled and ready for action. The situation escalated quickly from there. More bottles were thrown, some landing in Martha's yard and others breaking on the street in front of her house. The bikers were clearly using her property as target practice, seeing how close they could come to actually hitting her house. With each successful throw, they became bolder and more destructive. Then came the rocks. Someone had found a pile of landscaping stones from somewhere and decided they would make better projectiles than beer bottles. The first one hit Martha's mailbox with a loud clang, knocking it sideways. The second one struck her front window, though fortunately it wasn't thrown hard enough to break the glass. Martha knew she had to call the police, but when she picked up the phone, there was no dial tone. Someone had cut her telephone line. The realization that the bikers had planned this confrontation made her blood run cold. This wasn't just a party that had gotten out of hand. It was a deliberate attack on her home and her safety. Rex sensed her growing fear and moved closer to her side. She could feel the tension radiating from his body as he watched the front door, waiting for the threat to come closer. Martha reached down to stroke his head, drawing comfort from his presence while also trying to keep him calm. She knew that if the situation got much worse, Rex would try to defend her, regardless of the odds against him. The taunting from the party grew more personal and more threatening. The bikers were now shouting specifically at Martha's house, calling her name and making crude comments about what they intended to do to her. They seemed to know that she was trapped inside, unable to call for help and too frightened to come outside and confront them directly. "Come out and play, old lady," one of them shouted. "We want to show you how we welcome new neighbors." The irony wasn't lost on Martha. She had lived in the neighborhood for 6 decades while they had been there for less than 2 months. But she understood that facts didn't matter to people like this. They were bullies who enjoyed using fear and intimidation to control others, and they had decided that she would be their primary victim. As the sun began to set, the party took on an even more sinister tone. Someone had started a small fire in the street, feeding it with newspapers and pieces of wood. The dancing flames cast eerie shadows on the surrounding houses, and Martha could see the silhouettes of the bikers moving around like some kind of primitive tribal gathering. Rex had stopped pacing and was now standing perfectly still by the front door, his head cocked slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. Martha watched him carefully, knowing that his superior senses would give them their first warning if the bikers decided to move from harassment to direct attack. The moment of truth was approaching rapidly. Martha could feel it in the air, in Rex's posture, in the changing tone of the voices outside. The bikers had been drinking for hours. Their inhibitions were completely gone, and their leader was clearly working up the courage to take their intimidation campaign to the next level. Martha moved to her bedroom and retrieved the box containing her military medals. She pinned her bronze star to her shirt, not out of vanity, but as a reminder to herself of who she was and what she had survived. She was a soldier, a veteran who had faced enemies far more dangerous than a group of drunk bullies. She would not dishonor her service by cowering in fear. When she returned to the living room, Rex looked at her with what seemed like approval. He could sense her renewed determination, and it seemed to strengthen his own resolve. Together they took up their positions by the front window, ready to face whatever was coming next. The attack came just after 9 o'clock when the autumn darkness had settled fully over Maple Street. Martha heard the sound of breaking glass first. Not the casual throwing of beer bottles this time, but the deliberate smashing of her living room window. A large rock crashed through the glass, sending shards flying across her floor and letting in the cold night air along with the cruel laughter from outside. Rex exploded into action immediately. His protective instincts, held in check for so many weeks, finally had a clear target. He barked with a ferocity that Martha had never heard before, a deep, commanding sound that seemed to come from somewhere primal and ancient. It was the bark of a guardian, a warrior, a dog who would defend his family to the death. Shut that dog up, came a shout from outside, followed by more laughter and the sound of approaching footsteps on Martha's front walkway. Through the broken window, Martha could see the silhouettes of at least 6 bikers walking across her yard, picking up more rocks as they came. They were drunk, emboldened by their numbers, and clearly intent on escalating their attack beyond simple property damage. The leader, the big man with the beard, was carrying what looked like a baseball bat. Martha's military training kicked in automatically. She moved away from the windows and crouched low, trying to make herself a smaller target while keeping Rex close beside her. But the dog had other ideas. He positioned himself directly between Martha and the front door, his body rigid with determination and his teeth bared in a snarl that would have terrified anyone who saw it. The first biker to reach the front door began pounding on it with his fist, just as the leader had done weeks earlier. But this time was different. This time they weren't just trying to intimidate Martha, they were trying to break in. The pounding was harder, more violent, and accompanied by kicks that made the old wooden door shake in its frame. "Open up, old woman," the leader shouted. "We're coming in whether you like it or not." Rex's response was immediate and unmistakable. He launched himself at the door with such force that the entire house seemed to shake. His barks had become a continuous roar of rage and protective fury. He scratched at the door, trying to get at the attackers on the other side, his only thought being to protect Martha from the threat outside. The bikers seemed surprised by the intensity of Rex's reaction. Their pounding on the door slowed, and Martha could hear them talking among themselves, though she couldn't make out the words over Rex's barking. She realized that they had expected to find a helpless old woman and a harmless pet, not a decorated veteran and a dog who was clearly prepared to fight to the death for his family. But their surprise didn't last long. The pounding resumed, even more violent than before, and Martha heard the sound of wood beginning to splinter. The old door, which had served her faithfully for decades, was starting to give way under the assault. She knew that within minutes the bikers would be inside her house. That's when Rex made his decision. As another section of the doorframe cracked under the assault, he stopped barking and moved to Martha's side. For just a moment he looked up at her with those intelligent dark eyes, and she could swear she saw understanding there. He knew what he had to do, and he knew the risks. Before Martha could stop him, Rex ran to the back of the house. She heard the dog door in the kitchen bang open, the same door he had used countless times for innocent trips to the backyard. But this time was different. This time, Rex was going into battle. The bikers were so focused on breaking down the front door that they never saw the German Shepherd mix circling around the house through the shadows of the backyard. Rex moved with a silence and purpose that spoke to the hunting instincts of his ancestors. He was no longer just a pet. He was a protector executing a tactical flanking maneuver that would have made Martha's old army unit proud. Rex's attack came from the side, where none of the bikers were expecting it. He launched himself at the leader from the darkness beside the house, hitting the big man with the full force of his 80-pound body. The baseball bat went flying as the biker crashed to the ground with Rex on top of him, the dog's teeth finding their target with precision and determination. The leader's scream of pain and surprise shattered the night air, immediately followed by shouts of confusion and alarm from the other bikers. They had been prepared to intimidate an elderly woman, but they were completely unprepared to deal with a dog who was fighting for his family's life. Rex didn't waste time with the fallen leader. As soon as the man hit the ground, the dog was moving again, targeting the next closest threat. His training as Martha's companion had taught him to be gentle and patient, but his breeding as a German Shepherd had given him the instincts of a guardian and protector. Tonight, those instincts were fully awakened. The second biker tried to run, but Rex was faster. The dog brought him down with a tackle that would have impressed a football coach, then held him on the ground with a grip that made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. The man's screams joined those of the leader, creating a chaos of noise that was completely different from the confident threats they had been making just minutes earlier. The remaining bikers found themselves in a situation they had never anticipated. Instead of terrorizing a helpless victim, they were facing a tactical assault from an adversary who was faster, smarter, and more committed to the fight than they were. Rex moved between them like a shadow, striking when they least expected it and disappearing before they could retaliate. One of the bikers tried to help his fallen comrades, but Rex intercepted him before he could reach them. The dog's bark had returned, but now it was the controlled bark of a working dog, sharp and commanding. He was herding the bikers away from Martha's house, just as his ancestors had herded sheep and cattle across European pastures centuries ago. The tide of the confrontation had turned completely. The bikers, who had arrived with confidence and superior numbers, now found themselves scattered and demoralized. Two of their group were on the ground, unable or unwilling to get up while Rex maintained his vigilant guard over them. The others were backing away from the house, their earlier bravado replaced by genuine fear and confusion. From inside the house, Martha watched through the broken window in amazement and pride. Her loyal companion, the dog she had rescued from behind a grocery store 8 years ago, was single-handedly defending their home against overwhelming odds. Rex was showing the same courage and dedication that had earned Martha her Bronze Star decades earlier, and she felt her heart swell with love and gratitude for this remarkable animal who had chosen to risk everything for her safety. The leader of the bikers, still on the ground and bleeding from Rex's precise attack, began shouting orders to his companions, but his voice was weak and shaky, and his authority had been shattered along with his confidence. The dog had done more than just physically defeat him. Rex had exposed him as a coward and a bully who could only intimidate those weaker than himself. As the chaos continued in her front yard, Martha realized that Rex had bought them time, but the fight wasn't over yet. The bikers would regroup and they would be angry and humiliated. Rex had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. The sound of Rex's attack had carried far beyond Martha's front yard. Mrs. Chen, who had been watching nervously from her window across the street, immediately called 911 when she saw the dog take down the biker leader. Her voice was steady and clear as she reported what sounded like a home invasion in progress, with an elderly veteran under attack by multiple assailants. The young mother next door to Martha had also been watching, her husband beside her with his own phone ready. When they saw Rex launch his defensive assault, the husband grabbed his baseball bat and headed for the door, despite his wife's protests. He might not have been able to stand up to 6 drunk bikers alone, but with Rex holding several of them on the ground, the odds had shifted dramatically in favor of the defenders. All along Maple Street, neighbors who had been hiding in their houses for weeks suddenly found their courage returning. Porch lights came on, and people emerged from their homes carrying flashlights, phones, and whatever makeshift weapons they could find. The sight of an elderly woman's dog single-handedly defending her home had awakened something in the community that had been sleeping under layers of fear and intimidation. Rex continued his tactical assault with the precision of a trained military working dog. He had the leader and one other biker pinned on the ground, while the remaining four stood in a confused cluster near the street, unsure whether to help their fallen comrades or retreat to safety. Every time one of them took a step toward the house, Rex would shift position slightly, and his warning bark would make it clear that any aggressive move would result in immediate retaliation. The dog was bleeding from a cut on his shoulder where one of the bikers had managed to hit him with a piece of broken glass, but he showed no signs of pain or fatigue. His focus was complete and unwavering. He had committed himself to this fight, and he would see it through to the end regardless of the cost to himself. The wail of police sirens in the distance caused a shift in the dynamics of the confrontation. The bikers who were still standing began backing toward their motorcycles, clearly intending to flee before the authorities arrived. But Rex had anticipated this move. He released his grip on the two men he had been holding and positioned himself. Between the bikers and their bikes, his message unmistakable. No one was leaving until the police arrived. The leader of the bikers, bleeding and humiliated, tried to reassert his authority one last time. "This isn't over, old woman," he shouted toward Martha's house. "We know where you live." Rex's response was swift and decisive. He moved toward the fallen leader with such obvious intent that the man immediately scrambled backward, his hands raised in surrender. The dog had made it clear that any further threats against Martha would result in immediate and severe consequences. When the first police car arrived, its headlights illuminated a scene that would be talked about in the neighborhood for years to come. Rex stood guard over two injured bikers while four others huddled near their motorcycles under the watchful gaze of several neighbors who had emerged to support Martha. The elderly veteran herself stood on her front porch, her bronze star visible, on her shirt looking every inch the decorated soldier she had once been. Officer Rodriguez, who had been patrolling this area for over a decade, quickly assessed the situation. He had responded to several noise complaints about the bikers over the past few weeks, but this was clearly something much more serious. The broken window, the damaged front door, and the scattered rocks told a story of escalating harassment that had finally boiled over into outright assault. The biker leader tried to claim that Rex had attacked them without provocation, but his story fell apart quickly under Officer Rodriguez's questioning. The evidence of the attempted break-in was obvious, and several neighbors were eager to provide witness statements about weeks of harassment and intimidation. Mrs. Chen had even been recording the evening's events on her phone, providing clear documentation of the bikers' aggressive behavior. As more police units arrived, along with an ambulance for the injured bikers, the full scope of the situation became clear. The bikers weren't just troublesome neighbors. They were part of a larger criminal organization that had been using the house as a base for drug dealing and other illegal activities. The harassment of Martha had been their way of intimidating potential witnesses and establishing dominance in the neighborhood. Rex finally allowed the paramedics to approach the injured bikers, but he remained on high alert, ready to resume his defensive position if any of them made threatening moves toward Martha. The dog's behavior throughout the incident had been so controlled and purposeful that even the police officers were impressed. This wasn't a vicious animal attack. It was a trained guardian protecting his family. Detective Sarah Kim, who specialized in organized crime cases, arrived within the hour and immediately recognized the significance of what had happened. The bikers' reaction to being confronted by Rex had revealed their true nature as bullies and cowards, who could only function when they had overwhelming advantages over their victims. More importantly, their attempted home invasion had given the police grounds for search warrants that would allow them to investigate the house and its contents. Martha finally emerged from her house to check on Rex, and the reunion between the elderly veteran and her heroic dog brought tears to the eyes of several witnesses. Rex immediately went to her side, his tail wagging despite his injuries, seeking reassurance that she was safe and unharmed. Martha knelt down carefully and wrapped her arms around him, whispering words of gratitude and pride that only he could hear. The neighborhood had transformed in the space of a single evening, where there had been fear and isolation just hours before. There was now a sense of community and mutual support that had been missing for weeks. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other were comparing notes about the bikers' activities and offering to help with Martha's repairs and recovery. Young Tommy from across the street, who had been too scared to continue his snow-shoveling duties, approached Martha with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry I stopped helping you," he said. "I was scared, but Rex wasn't scared. He's the bravest dog in the world." Martha smiled and reached out to pat the boy's shoulder. "Sometimes being brave means being scared but doing the right thing anyway," she told him. Rex was scared too, but he knew I needed his help. As the police finished their work and the last of the bikers were loaded into patrol cars or ambulances, Detective Kim approached Martha with news that would change everything. The search of the biker house had uncovered a sophisticated drug operation, along with weapons and evidence linking the group to several other crimes in the area. The bikers wouldn't be returning to Maple Street anytime soon. Rex had done more than just defend his home and his family. His brave action had exposed a criminal enterprise and freed an entire neighborhood from weeks of fear and intimidation. The loyal dog who had been rescued from behind a grocery store had become the unlikely hero who saved his community. The sound of Rex's attack had carried far beyond Martha's front yard. Mrs. Chen, who had been watching nervously from her window across the street, immediately called 911 when she saw the dog take down the biker leader. Her voice was steady and clear as she reported what sounded like a home invasion in progress, with an elderly veteran under attack by multiple assailants. The young mother next door to Martha had also been watching, her husband beside her with his own phone ready. When they saw Rex launch his defensive assault, the husband grabbed his baseball bat and headed for the door, despite his wife's protests. He might not have been able to stand up to 6 drunk bikers alone, but with Rex holding several of them on the ground, the odds had shifted dramatically in favor of the defenders. All along Maple Street, neighbors who had been hiding in their houses for weeks suddenly found their courage returning. Porch lights came on and people emerged from their homes carrying flashlights, phones, and whatever makeshift weapons they could find. The sight of an elderly woman's dog, single-handedly defending her home, had awakened something in the community that had been sleeping under layers of fear and intimidation. Rex continued his tactical assault with the precision of a trained military working dog. He had the leader and one other biker pinned on the ground, while the remaining 4 stood in a confused cluster near the street, unsure whether to help their fallen comrades or retreat to safety. Every time one of them took a step toward the house, Rex would shift position slightly, and his warning bark would make it clear that any aggressive move would result in immediate retaliation. The dog was bleeding from a cut on his shoulder, where one of the bikers had managed to hit him with a piece of broken glass, but he showed no signs of pain or fatigue. His focus was complete and unwavering. He had committed himself to this fight, and he would see it through to the end regardless of the cost to himself. The wail of police sirens in the distance caused a shift in the dynamics of the confrontation. The bikers who were still standing began backing toward their motorcycles, clearly intending to flee before the authorities arrived. But Rex had anticipated this move. He released his grip on the 2 men he had been holding and positioned himself between the bikers and their bikes. His message unmistakable. No one was leaving until the police arrived. The leader of the bikers, bleeding and humiliated, tried to reassert his authority one last time. "This isn't over, old woman," he shouted toward Martha's house. "We know where you live." Rex's response was swift and decisive. He moved toward the fallen leader with such obvious intent that the man immediately scrambled backward, his hands raised in surrender. The dog had made it clear that any further threats against Martha would result in immediate and severe consequences. When the first police car arrived, its headlights illuminated a scene that would be talked about in the neighborhood for years to come. Rex stood guard over 2 injured bikers, while 4 others huddled near their motorcycles under the watchful gaze of several neighbors who had emerged to support Martha. The elderly veteran herself stood on her front porch, her bronze star visible on her shirt, looking every inch the decorated soldier she had once been. Officer Rodriguez, who had been patrolling this area for over a decade, quickly assessed the situation. He had responded to several noise complaints about the bikers over the past few weeks, but this was clearly something much more serious. The broken window, the damaged front door, and the scattered rocks told a story of escalating harassment that had finally boiled over into outright assault. The biker leader tried to claim that Rex had attacked them without provocation, but his story fell apart quickly under Officer Rodriguez's questioning. The evidence of the attempted break-in was obvious, and several neighbors were eager to provide witness statements about weeks of harassment and intimidation. Mrs. Chen had even been recording the evening's events on her phone, providing clear documentation of the bikers' aggressive behavior. As more police units arrived, along with an ambulance for the injured bikers, the full scope of the situation became clear. The bikers weren't just troublesome neighbors. They were part of a larger criminal organization that had been using the house as a base for drug dealing and other illegal activities. The harassment of Martha had been their way of intimidating potential witnesses and establishing dominance in the neighborhood. Rex finally allowed the paramedics to approach the injured bikers, but he remained on high alert, ready to resume his defensive position if any of them made threatening moves toward Martha. The dog's behavior throughout the incident had been so controlled and purposeful that even the police officers were impressed. This wasn't a vicious animal attack. It was a trained guardian protecting his family. Detective Sarah Kim, who specialized in organized crime cases, arrived within the hour and immediately recognized the significance of what had happened. The bikers' reaction to being confronted by Rex had revealed their true nature as bullies and cowards, who could only function when they had overwhelming advantages over their victims. More importantly, their attempted home invasion had given the police grounds for search warrants that would allow them to investigate the house and its contents. Martha finally emerged from her house to check on Rex, and the reunion between the elderly veteran and her heroic dog brought tears to the eyes of several witnesses. Rex immediately went to her side, his tail wagging despite his injuries, seeking reassurance that she was safe and unharmed. Martha knelt down carefully and wrapped her arms around him, whispering words of gratitude and pride that only he could hear. The neighborhood had transformed in the space of a single evening. Where there had been fear and isolation just hours before, there was now a sense of community and mutual support that had been missing for weeks. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other were comparing notes about the bikers' activities and offering to help with Martha's repairs and recovery. Young Tommy from across the street, who had been too scared to continue his snow-shoveling duties, approached Martha with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry I stopped helping you," he said. "I was scared, but Rex wasn't scared. He's the bravest dog in the world." Martha smiled and reached out to pat the boy's shoulder. "Sometimes being brave means being scared, but doing the right thing anyway," she told him. Rex was scared too, but he knew I needed his help. As the police finished their work and the last of the bikers were loaded into patrol cars or ambulances, Detective Kim approached Martha with news that would change everything. The search of the biker house had uncovered a sophisticated drug operation, along with weapons and evidence linking the group to several other crimes in the area. The bikers wouldn't be returning to Maple Street anytime soon. Rex had done more than just defend his home and his family. His brave action had exposed a criminal enterprise and freed an entire neighborhood from weeks of fear and intimidation. The loyal dog who had been rescued from behind a grocery store had become the unlikely hero who saved his community.